Okay, is this working? Yeah. Thanks to you all coming along again. So it's my great pleasure today to introduce, becoming a bit of a routine now, we're always introducing the world's best speaker in X. It's a really good lineup that we've got. Brent is, I think, the world's expert in conscientiousness, a personality trait that you might have heard of described as grit. And we've had an audience that will have different understandings of what this trait is. I think you're going to find it really interesting and learn a lot. Brent's had a fascinating background moving through psychology from the West Coast up now to University of Illinois, where he's really, I think, bringing together different worlds of psychology, individual differences, connections to European research, large studies, how governments think about employment policy and individual differences, so interventions and change. So just an awful lot to learn, which means I'm going to get out of the way and let him tell you all about it for the next, as long as it takes, and then questions and then a reception. So welcome, Brent, please.
Is this on? Yay! Since I'm between you and the reception, I'll try to be brief. No. Thank you for the introduction, Tim. It's really, I know, when you go someplace, you're supposed to say, it's really a pleasure to be here. But it is a pleasure to be here, and I'll kind of contextualize that a bit by giving you a little anecdote of at least my behavior. Oftentimes when I go give a speech someplace else or a talk at an institution, I always like to read the faculty's research just a little bit because it's an opportunity to learn something, and then of course you can, at the very least, talk about their research because that's a good thing when the conversation dies, which hasn't done here. I had absolutely no reason to do that in this case because I'm so familiar with the work of the group here, especially that works on individual differences, because they're so good and they're so prolific, and they've basically been an inspiration, if not, let's say, guided a lot of the work I've done. I'm also an editor of a journal, and I think I've personally edited far too many of their papers. Some rejections, some acceptances, trying to be even-handed, but I think your group here is responsible for more of the papers I've accepted at Psych Science than any group in the world. Just as an example of the type of work that's done here. So it really is a pleasure to be here. It's wonderful to see the people that I see in name and read their work on the side in person. So thank you for the invitation. Today I'll talk about the long and the short of personality, stability, and change. The goals for today are simple. I'll report on some new data that we've collected in the last few years that seem to be on, let's say, opposite ends of the spectrum when it comes to personality, stability, and change. So the first thing I'll tell you about is a study that looks at personality, stability, and change over a 50-year period. So one of the longest longitudinal studies to be done, with the exception, of course, of some of the studies done here, that have bothered to ask the question, if you are a high school student, college student like many of you are, if you turn to the side and look at your friend or your mate next to you, 50 years from now, will you recognize that person? Trust me, their hair will be gray, they will look a little bit different physically, but psychologically, will you be able to see who they are in that signal that you see today or not? That's the first one. The second, we'll report on some new data that builds on a lot of data that we just accumulated on whether you can change personality traits in the short run. And then I'll do my best to weave together what seem to be two diametrically opposed ideas into a narrative. But that's the goal for today. Because I did not know your background, I wanted to start with some definitions, of course. So I am a personality psychologist by trade, and the major unit of analysis in our field is the personality trait, and I'll be talking for the most part about personality trait development in this case. Here is my definition of a personality trait for what it's worth. They're the relatively automatic thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that you exhibit. I like to point out that the automaticity in my mind is the important part. It's not the thing you think about in great detail, though you may in retrospect, especially if somebody points out that what you did was offensive or problematic. It's the thing you do automatically when you enter a room. An extrovert doesn't walk into a room and say to themselves, I'm an extrovert. It's my goal to be outgoing. there are people in this room, I must now talk. That's not the way humans work, right? An extrovert walks into a room, sees people, and the discriminative stimulus is enough to get them to go, and they talk. Now, of course, if you talk in the absence of people, that's something different than extroversion. Your clinical friends can talk to you about that. If you do that automatically, we really don't talk to me, talk to your faculty. But it's really the thing that you do without thinking about it. Obviously, you can think about it, and obviously that we ask people in our dominant way of assessing personality traits to think about it by reporting on what you think you do. So it's not absent of cognition, but when I think of personality, it's the thing that you do automatically. The material is the material that we use for all things in psychology, thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. I point that out just to be clear that I'm not just talking about behaviors, because it's also important how you think about the world, what you expect of others, and how you feel about being late to something or somebody else being late to something, for example, which is punctuality. It's not just whether you show up, but if you're offended or you don't get at all upset about making other people upset, that's, let's say, a discriminative stimulus for something like being punctual. These patterns are quote-unquote relatively enduring across time and place. They tend to manifest within certain contexts, as I alluded to with the extroversion anecdote. Extroversion is intrinsically tied to social interactions. You need people to be extroverted. So there's a trope that people trot out typically with personality psychology, especially if they're trying to be critical, and say that it's decontextualized. It's not decontextualized. It might be aggregated to a degree that you don't care for. That's legitimate in all cases. But as I said, if you're extroverted in the absence of other people, you're suffering from a schizoid disease of some sort or a psychotic break, that's a different thing. Agreeableness also requires other people. Conscientiousness requires work. Neuroticism requires threat. So these big traits that people talk about are not decontextualized. And then I always like to argue that these things develop, and so I add this part just to irk my friends who don't think that, that basically these automatic patterns do develop with age especially, and they tend to develop in a relatively positive way. So most people, most of the time, become a little more confident in themselves, nicer, more conscientious, more emotionally stable, thank goodness, and openness we can talk about. But those types of changes do occur. So that's the definition of personality trait I'm working with. I'm not saying that this is endorsable or the best definition of the world, but it's the one I'm working with at the moment. I will use the Big Five lexicon or Big Six lexicon, which, how many of you heard of this? Wonderful, good, good. So you know what these are. So this is extroversion, agreeableness, conscientiousness, neuroticism, openness to experience, and if you are a Hexaco fan, honesty, humility. And I'm agnostic as to the numbers that we should use. I like the Big Six. I find it just deliciously ironic that we didn't discover honesty in the United States. Go think of the irony now. So I'm more than willing to reinsert it into the lexicon just for the irony. So you might, yeah, as was alluded to, I study conscientiousness, which in its more effective description is called grit. If you don't like these terms, you're not alone. These are just the terms that one of our academic friends came up with at a point in the 1960s, and we stuck with them. They're horrible marketing terms. Extroversion, if you don't like, or agreeableness, talk about social skills. So if you find it offensive to think about it differently. Grit is great for conscientiousness. I can't argue with grit. One syllable captures everything anybody wants. Nobody thinks it's a trait. It's perfect. Neuroticism, call it resiliency, and you don't have to think about it negatively. And then openness to experience, curiosity or creativity. So the terminological aspect is immaterial, but this is the taxonomy that we ended up with. I will use it throughout the discussion about what happens in terms of stability and change. Okay, definitions aside. And one thing I should say, if I'm not being clear, or if I'm talking too fast, which is often the case, stop me and tell me to repeat, or ask the question that you need to. I don't mind being interrupted. Okay, why should we care about the long-term stability of personality traits and simultaneously the short-term changeability? Well, okay, perfect indulgence. I would do it even if they weren't important questions, okay? I think they're cool questions. Like I said, think about your high school mates and the people you knew when you were young. If you run into them in 50 years, you're going to know who they are. Are they going to be different people? You marry somebody when you're 25, are they going to be the same person at 75? You might. I mean, you're investing pretty heavily. You might be more interested in whether you can change them or not. That's the second half of the talk. Right? And so these are interesting questions, and trust me, I would have indulged them without there being any importance tagged on them. But for a variety of reasons, I think the importance of these questions becomes more salient, especially lately. One reason why is because personality psychology has been unambiguously discovered by other guilds, other areas of science and social policy that have, let's say, come to the conclusion that what's going on in personality psychology is important. So most specifically, Jim Heckman discovered individual differences back in a paper in 2006 and has been a strong proponent ever since, and has, I think, single-handedly convinced the economists that it's okay to study non-cognitive predictors of human capital. And thus you have organizations like the OECD and the World Bank now assessing personality under the assumption that this is going to help predict human capital formation in a variety of countries or different economies around the globe. So it's been put on the map that way. In education, it has now become quite widely accepted that things other than cognitive ability are important. So go figure. Not that cognitive ability is not important. It is important. This end of the room is going to start throwing tomatoes sooner. But that it's not everything, and that there are lots of things you need to do as an adult that hopefully education would prepare you for. Things like showing up on time and showing up the next day on time and not getting in a fight with your supervisor and actually being able to communicate with people in a reasonable fashion. Those are all personality variables. Those aren't cognitive ability. And the educational researchers and policymakers and guilds have discovered this. In the US, we have the ACT and the ETS organizations which do the big testing, GREs, SATs and the like. And they're now developing non-cognitive predictors for school systems to use. And then, of course, medicine, because of work that's been done here and other places, medical researchers have discovered the importance of individual differences, most specifically to things like mortality, but also morbidity. And so you have some very big groups that are looking at this. Why? They have discovered that these things that we call personality traits predict important outcomes. Let me show you a few of those findings. So this is a table stolen from Jim Heckman's, one of Jim Heckman's tomes, I think would be the right description. For those of you who complain about the reading amount in any of your classes, this is about 2/3 of the way through Jim's paper. This is just one of them. So page 93, you will find this graph which shows you the aggregate results of the importance of the big five to educational attainment. And as Jim will point out, the most important personality trait in that domain is grit or conscientiousness. Students who are more conscientious tend to do better in terms of their grades. They tend to do better in terms of going on and achieving higher educational attainment. And it's above and beyond the role of cognitive ability. So for whatever it's worth or how it's done, it's an important trait domain. In terms of financial outcomes, this is data from the Dunedin longitudinal study. Timmy Moffat and Ashlem Caspi and a whole group of us did this paper back in 2011. We used age 10 self-control, nominally assessed by parents, teachers, clinicians, and the kids themselves to predict outcomes at age 32, one of which was financial standing. And the kids at age 10 who were in the highest tertile of self-control were most high on socioeconomic status, income, and financial planfulness. So they were taking care of their business and they were doing better in the labor market. They were also not suffering from financial struggles, not only in their own opinion, but in the opinion of a close associate. So not bad to see something predicting over a 20 or 30 year period like that. And again, this was incremental to family background in terms of socioeconomic status and IQ. Here is a little work we did in 2007 looking at outcomes like a divorce. Divorce is nobody's goal. I always like to ask my undergraduates, how many of you are planning on a divorce? And then you ask them, how many of you are going to experience a divorce? Of course, half the room will. Can you predict that? Yeah, you can predict that. You can predict it pretty well from personality. You can't predict it very well from IQ or socioeconomic background. Oddly enough, rich people get divorced just as much as poor people. And what you really do see are nice predictions from the personality domain. Not only do we value partners who are nicer, more conscientious, and more emotionally stable, but when we find them, we stick with them longer. If we have partners who are less emotionally stable, less conscientious, and less nice, we tend to divorce more often for whatever reason. This, from an economic perspective, is profoundly important, right? Because one of the best ways, at least in the United States, to suffer poverty is to find yourself being a woman and getting divorced because of the way the system is set up. So this is important from an economic and a societal perspective also. In terms of the health outcomes, this is a study by Antonio Terracciano, now of a stream of studies that were inspired by David Bennett's group in Chicago, showing that conscientiousness as well as neuroticism predicts the onset of Alzheimer's. So those individuals who were more conscientious were less likely to experience Alzheimer's. It's now been shown so many times that you've got a robust meta-analysis showing that it's a protective factor. And then this is one little study of many that have looked at the relationship between conscientiousness and mortality. This is our study, and I like to bring it up because it's so somewhat innocuous. So here's your line of people who are more conscientious. They're not dying as early as people who are less conscientious. This was a serendipitous study. I was sitting in a meeting and a person turned to me and said, "Oh, did you know that we asked a bunch of personality questions in the 1996, side study from HRS?" I said, "No." And they said, it didn't work. So you should get that data. And 10 innocuous little adjectives were administered to a group of about 500 folks. So the worst possible way you could assess something, right? That's what we use to predict mortality. So say to yourself 10 times, you're not conscientious. It might have profound ramifications for your well-being, at least how long you live. I'm not going to say you're leading a happier life, but nonetheless, this has been established quite well that those of you who are more conscientious than others tend to live longer than your peers. And we're now trying to tease apart the mechanisms, but this is, in some respects, decent justification for the fact that it's an important trait variable. So that has led to a number of, let's say, policy groups, like I said, asking policy-relevant questions, especially about the status of personality and the status of stability and change. So the first reason why we might want to investigate the very long-term stability of personality is actually IQ. So should we consider personality traits exogenous? So in the economics world or the demography world, something that's exogenous is outside of the system causing things in the system, not being caused by something else. If something is really, really stable, like IQ, oftentimes it's convenient and useful and probably appropriate to just say, look, it's predicting things and it is a cause. The same question can be asked of personality traits. Lots of people assume that they're exogenous, that they're causal in the sense that they're not changeable, but the assumption hasn't been tested, at least not quite as well as it has been with cognitive ability. So understanding that very, very long-term stability is an important question from this perspective. How you treat conceptually a personality system that you're going to use. Do you want to use it once and assess it, use it to predict things, or do you want to use it as a dynamic variable that might actually develop? That's the other question. Oh, sorry. If personality traits are not as stable as something like cognitive ability, then to some degree you really want to ask the question, what's the intervening variable? Jim Heckman, for example, says that the intervening variable is education attainment. So personality traits don't cause these outcomes. It causes you to become a good student. You go get a higher education degree, and that makes you healthier, wealthier, and wiser. Okay? So that's one way you work it. If it's really stable, then you wouldn't have to do that. The flip side is that if it's not stable, is it a skill? So this is a common term used in especially economics. They're now repackaging personality traits as skills, much to the offense of many of my personality brethren who I ask them to review these papers and they reject them outright because they call these things skills. But it's a fair question, right? If personality traits develop, can they be developed? Can you actually do something to them so that a child can learn to be gritty, or a young adult can understand that bullying somebody else or getting in arguments all the time might be an ineffective way of maintaining a positive relationship with someone, right? What can you do to intervene? And is it worthwhile doing so? So these are the, let's say, justifications for the effort, so to speak. Okay. What do we know about the long-term stability of personality? Well, ostensibly we know a lot. This is our 2000 meta-analysis where we synthesized 152 longitudinal studies and showed that personality traits are stable. I'm waving my hands on purpose. I'll do that a few times because this at the time was the definitive statement. It was so important to personality psychologists that, ironically, somewhat, in 2010, Ferguson came along and did a second meta-analysis of a second set of longitudinal studies and found the same thing. I was very mollified that a meta-analysis would replicate and that the person went through all this effort and he found exactly the same thing. Looking over the medium term. So these bars represent the average stabilities for longitudinal studies in these data sets, which on average go out about 7 years. So looking out about 7 years, you get stabilities in the 0.4 to 0.7 range, which from a standard within psychology is pretty high, right? That means if you look at the person next to you and you say, okay, in 7 years, will I recognize them? You've got about a 75% chance of being right if you break that into behavioral effect size of some sort, right? Which is non-trivial. So there's a decent amount of stability there. It's not the same thing as long-term stability. And so at one point, my colleague and I, Chris Fraley, asked the question, how long can we go and what does it look like and what are the factors that explain whether personality traits are stable? And this is the, let's say, graph that we came up with. So this is from Chris Fraley's work. And we're looking at stability from about age 16 throughout the life course. And you'll notice there's a huge drop-off as you go through time. And then, most importantly, from Chris's perspective especially, you get this plateau, and it's at a non-zero level of stability. It's not huge. It's about 0.3, 0.4 when disattenuated, about 0.2 when raw. But it seemed to be there, right? And then when we did the modeling of this effect, we found that you could account for the stability of personality with two things: a consistency or unchanging factor, read something like genes, and a stochastic factor, life experience, random things happen to you. With those two things, you could explain the pattern of stability and change we saw in the data to date at that point. The problem with the data to date is that there was really no data up here. So the longest longitudinal studies are about 20, 30 years, and not 40, 50 years. And so we really were extrapolating a bit beyond the data when we made that estimation and said, we need to do this. We should collect more longitudinal data. Well, some people have done that. First were Hampson, Goldberg in 2006, looking at the Hawaii longitudinal study where they had ratings of kids by teachers, and they followed up when the individuals were 50. And they found pretty impressive stability in many places: extroversion 0.3, agreeableness 0.14, conscientiousness 0.26, openness 0.12, and then whoops, neuroticism was 0. This was much to their consternation because they said, look, Roberts and Fraley and those folks said there should be stability. There's not stability. This is a problem. I didn't disagree with them, being a reviewer on their paper, but it caused them consternation, and it should, right? What's the true long-term stability? From the Fraley model perspective, if it is trending towards 0, that's a really important thing, because then you might not have that signal that's there that goes over the long course of life. Enter just recently, who are these people? Harris, Brett, Johnson, and Deary. A few people in this room. There's their wonderfully unimpressive table. Well, let me rephrase that. Impressive in the sense that it's a beautifully done study. It is the longest long-term study of personality stability ever done. And they found absolutely no stability whatsoever. So you don't need to see the particulars. Essentially, it's 0. It doesn't matter whether you're looking at the items or you're looking at the aggregate. There is no stability from age 11, right, all the way, 14, sorry, to 77. You think about it in the context of your friends sitting next to you, you won't know them when you go to your 50th reunion because they'll be a completely different person, right? So this was troubling. It's not troubling, it's interesting, right? It's possible then that if you look at our graph, we misestimated it. We need to start throwing in some zeros. Thus, when I had the opportunity to look at the same issue in a different data set, I jumped at it. So some of you are familiar with this data set. It's called the Project Talent Study. It's a kind of, in my mind, it's just a perfect example of how the US squanders its investments as opposed to what happens in UK and Europe. When you guys do a good study like the Lothian birth cohort or longitudinal studies of individuals in different countries, you tend to say, okay, we should probably keep on following them up. In the United States, the classic longitudinal study is some study that was invested in for about 5 years, then forgotten. And this is a perfect example. Project Talent was a study of high school students done in 1960. They assessed 440,000 high school students in the US for 4 days. It was a 5% representative sample of the US student population. It was conducted by the American Institute of Research. I always feel like I should have a flag that flows next to it. And it was the defining study for this organization. And it's amazing. They measured everything. And unbeknownst to me, which would have changed the entire topography of my career, they measured personality, but I didn't find out about it until about 5 years ago. If I'd known about that as a graduate student, I would have stolen this data and done nothing else. So it was very interesting, and it then actually, I wouldn't say it was forgotten, but the investment fell off. And so the ability to follow up and track the students wasn't invested in properly, never really played out the way it should. Most of the papers were stuck in tech reports, and the data was stuffed into boxes, as it was back in the 60s in those wonderful scan cards, and then put into a closet until about 2010 2008, 2009, when the American Institutes of Research came out and said, hey, we should probably follow these people up. So they came to a bunch of us and said, you guys do this, follow these people up. And some economists decided they could, or decided they would do something. And they said, we need to follow up on the group, and we need to follow up on their personality. They hired us to look at the personality measure. There was a personality measure in the first assessment. It was 150 items. We call it the Project Talent Personality Inventory, for a lack of a better term. Ostensibly at that time, it measured 10 things: vigor, calmness, mature personality, impulsiveness, self-confidence, culture, sociability, many of which fall nicely within certain categories of the Big Five. So maturity is your best marker of conscientiousness, so is tidiness, social sensitivity is agreeableness, leadership and sociability or extroversion, culture is openness, calmness is emotional stability. It's not a good measure, they're not pure measures of the Big Five, so they're more like flavors of the Big Five would be the way I'd describe it. And we did some work on that. The economists came back and tried to find out how many people they could track down at age 77. They pulled a list of about 5,000 individuals from the overall list of 440,000, tried to recontact them. We're successful in getting to about 2,000 of these individuals and threw them a survey. Part of that survey, we had created a shortened version of the PT-PI measure, half the items instead of the full item set, to measure each of the scales again. And so we have a nice, reasonably large sample size of American citizens who've been tracked over a 50-year period, from the time when they're approximately age 16 to the time when they're about 68 or 69. And here's what we found. So the details are probably less material than the average that you see across the board. The blue bars are the raw correlation coefficients. The yellow bars or orange bars are the disattenuated, if you are a fan of that type of practice. What you see is systematically across all of these measures, stability of personality that's around 0.2 to 0.3. The average in terms of the disattenuated correlation was 0.3. And you might want to make something about the variability in that, but I wouldn't invest too much. In most of the aggregate work we've done, you don't get starkly different stabilities across the Big Five. Minor differences at most. But in this case, you see actually an amount of stability that, at least from the Fraley model, is somewhat comforting. So I counterbalance these with another estimate of the stability of personality. And it seems like we got the number about where you would expect it based on the model, which from a modeling perspective was nice to know. We did some other things. So one of the questions that we wanted to address was not just the question about whether your extroversion was stable or your agreeableness was stable, because that's not how most of us treat each other. We're not a bundle of single variables. We see each other as persons. And so you see each other in a profile of personality traits, right? You're higher on extroversion than you are in conscientiousness, or you're more conscientious than extroverted. And that's how we know each other. And that's a type of stability that you do across the measure. And we decided to look at that. And there the numbers are a little more impressive. So close to 0.4, which means that you have about a 65% chance of being right. If you look at your friend now and say, if I see you in 50 years, I'll kind of know the topography of personality still. Most likely, of course, those cardinal traits that they have might still be in evidence. Other parts of their personality might have had the edges worn off through the weathering of age, right? And certain parts might have changed dramatically. But you're still going to be able to see the outlines of their personality in 50 years. There's lots of ways of doing this. For those of you who are nerds about profile stability, random profile stability was 0.25, which means that in the aggregate, we are all alike because we all have a positive view of ourselves and other people. So on average, everybody is alike. And then there's something called distinctive profile stability. So how you're not alike from the average person is still stable above chance. Okay? So from the stability perspective, this was interesting. Did I mention? Personality traits also showed systematic changes across those 50 years. By changes in this case, I mean mean level changes. So we didn't just stop with the stability, we looked at how the means changed over time. Why is this important? Well, this is a highly misleading but dramatic slide characterizing our 2006 meta-analysis, where we examined how personality traits change across the life course. And this study showed, like I alluded to, that most of us get more emotionally stable, more agreeable, and more conscientious as we age. It's a bit of a fabrication, though. because we didn't actually track change from age 10 through age 80. So this is a bit of a cheat. What we did was we tracked change from 20 to 30, 30 to 40, 40 to 50, right, on average, short-term estimates. And if you see the little breaks in the lines, these are actually all separate estimates of change. And at some point it became convenient to kind of stack them together and say, if I had the ideal longitudinal study that bothered to track people for 50 years, this is the dramatic amount of change you'll see, which from our standpoint was actually provocative, because it's saying that you're getting a full standard deviation of change on personality traits from age 20 to age 60 on average. But it was, let's say, a stretch. We were taking liberties with the data that's probably inappropriate. And so what you have with the Project Talent study is the opportunity to put that to the test, right? And it's an important question to ask in a true longitudinal study of that amount, because there's always this counteraction of the idea of a set point, of a genetically defined core aspect of your personality that should always be dragging your personality back to where you were before. And if that idea is correct, then we really shouldn't see the aggregate amount of change that you see, right? You should always be regressing to your mean with time. And so there shouldn't be an accumulation of development. There could be some, it really depends on the slings of arrows of life and the achievements and the things that cause change. But there really should be a less dramatic change as you see here. So this question was important to us to see how much change you find on these across a 50-year period, because the answer would give us some indication of what model or what assumption would be correct. And this is what we got. So vigor doesn't change much. Calmness, which is your best estimate of neuroticism or emotional stability, over a standard deviation of change. Mature personality, which is your best indicator of conscientiousness, was almost 2 standard deviations of change. Self-confidence, which is an aspect of assertiveness in the extroversion domain, that's a full standard deviation of change. Leadership is a half a standard deviation. Social sensitivity, which is agreeableness, is a full standard deviation of change. Tidiness, which is an aspect of conscientiousness, was a full standard deviation of change. I felt pretty good about this. I've been cheating for a long time, and my data told me that I wasn't necessarily cheating that much. So it's really interesting. I actually find this to be the most provocative finding. Because what it really does say is, there's a progressive development that happens with age. And here's one of the best studies, at least in terms of examining mean level change, that we could do. And it's really confirming the meta-analytic estimates, which were an extrapolation, which is interesting. The orange bars and the blue bars indicate adjustments made for the fact that they weren't identical scales at both times. And for the most part, things are the same. So, why is the magnitude of change important? It shows that personality traits do change, which is, of course, interesting. It shows, in my mind at least, that this strong set point model, which says you should always drag your personality back to where you started, is probably not accurate. I'm more than willing to accept a set point model, especially given the stability findings that we get. But then the question really becomes, how big is it? How strong is it? How much of a genetic signal do you have? This is why your university is so important, because you'll answer that question someday, right? If you really do have the genes, you really do have the index that can be linked to neuroticism, you really ask the question, how much of that signal lasts across the life course? Then we can actually make some estimates about how that works. But in this case, it really seems that we have to have something other than the set point model to understand development. And of course, if personality traits change, it invites the question of whether they can be changed, right? That was, for years, possibly the most common question I received at the end of a talk, because I'd usually end here. I could end here. But I won't, because we decided we wanted to answer that question ourselves. So I'm going to tell you about 2 studies, one of which you should have read because it came out this year, but I'll go through the findings again. So can personality traits be changed? Yes. Questions? Okay. So, as has been our practice, instead of asking this question with our own primary data collection, we decided to use other people's hard labor. Thank you for all those folks who actually did this. In our case, we wanted to ask basic questions about personality development. We had, let's say, come across evidence, mostly in clinical psychology, that you could see personality trait change in clinical settings. I thought, at least initially, that this would be my first quick and dirty meta-analysis. Never use the term quick and dirty to describe any study, no less a meta-analysis, because I didn't think there was going to be much data. And I thought I knew most of the studies. So it should be about 30, 40 studies, should be relatively easy, a year's worth of work. Yeah, I was wrong. So what questions did I want to ask with this study? Which traits change the most? Does therapy cause personality trait change? That's a nice question, right? Which therapy changes personality the most? Seeing a cognitive behavioral therapist, a psychoanalytic therapist, a Jungian analyst, a reflective interpersonal or social relationships therapist? Who's the best to go to if you're going to get your personality changed by a therapist? Which patients change the most, which will play a role in our story? And then how fast does the change occur, right? Does it happen really quick or does it happen progressively like we see? So I have to confess that before doing this study, I had concluded from my observations of the observational longitudinal studies that yes, there is personality trait change, but it's a really incremental thing. So thinking about your friend sitting next to you, 10 years from now, you might not even notice the change that occurred, right? Because it's just slight, it's modest, let's say, as you're going through time, and it really accumulates over the life course. That was I wrote that as a conclusion about how personality traits develop. I was wrong, and I proved myself wrong, which is my favorite thing to do. So we went down what I like to call the meta-analytic rabbit hole. So we focused on clinical studies that had reported some type of personality trait change. The obvious candidates were the personality trait measures. Those studies I knew about, there were a handful of them, about 30. What I didn't realize was that the clinicians are a thorough bunch, and they've been measuring personality traits by other names for a long time. So they used measures like the inventory of interpersonal problems. This doesn't sound like a personality trait measure until you look at it, and it is. It's maladaptive extroversion and maladaptive agreeableness. Cloninger scales, which are very popular in the psychiatric literature, and then everybody seemed to use Spielberger's state trait anxiety and state trait anger. State trait, right? He was measuring anger as a trait. And being good methodologists, the clinicians tend to like to measure everything in their evaluation studies, so they included both the trait and the state. This proved to be a nightmare for our search, which is why the project stretched on, because the clinicians didn't think much of this. It was just another outcome. So you couldn't search by the search terms, you couldn't search by the idea, I couldn't put in personality trait change and clinical psychology. It wasn't there. You put in personality and clinical psychology, you get 500,000 hits, right? So we had to dig through the data by hand, by eye, actually finding people on our own. And it was mostly because of this, because you had lots of reports about outcomes that were trait measures, but were not named as such. Our criteria was if you were asked to make a rating that was global, internal, and stable. I am an extroverted person. I'm a talkative person. I get into arguments a lot. That's a typical personality measure. Many of the clinical measures work the same way. We did not do things that we consider states, depression, symptoms, interview protocols, any of the symptom checklists that clinicians do. We just stuck with what we thought of as personality traits. We found we found thousands of studies. We culled it down to 207 studies that had the adequate amount of information that we could use to affect the meta-analysis. 20,000 people, which isn't that much, but nonetheless more than we typically have. The average intervention duration was about 24 weeks. This is largely because the psychoanalytic interventions were usually a year or more. So the CBT people would get you out of there in a few weeks. The psychoanalyst wants to see you for a long time. And so this is a median is probably better, so that it was much shorter on average. And this is mostly in the United States, where reimbursement rates are such that you don't get money past 18 weeks or so. So you got to get it done quick. Multiple interventions, pharmacological, medications, CBT, supportive therapy, psychoanalysis, multiple types of disorders, depression, anxiety, drug and alcohol abuse, eating disorders, personality disorders. So every kind of range you could possibly have. This is what we found. Across the big five, seeing a psychotherapist changes your personality traits. And most wonderfully and most appropriately, changes neuroticism in the direction of emotional stability to the tune of 1/2 of a standard deviation. And so what I like to say is that by seeing a therapist, you change your personality traits as much as 1/2 of a life, right? So you might say, hey, it's a small effect size. From my perspective, within the parameters of my world, looking at personality development, I did not expect this, genuinely did not expect this. I expected 0.25, I thought something good was happening in therapy. I was convinced by my colleagues that they were doing some good work with people, but I thought it would be modest, especially with personality traits. But in this case, it's immodest. It's a half a standard deviation, and it's in the domain you'd expect. For those of you who like causality, we parsed out the studies that were true experiments. Most of these somewhat dated now because these are the weightless control studies that were done back in the 70s and 80s. At this point in clinical psychology, you don't do weightless controls because it's deemed unethical. So this is a kind of a history lesson in some respects. But in the true experimental studies, you get the same pattern. So if you are into causality, seeing a therapist causes change in personality traits to the extent that you believe those studies are well run. And they're pretty well run, but I'm not going to sell them completely. Okay? One of the questions that comes up naturally in this case is, well, is the change that you're seeing in personality really change in personality? So there's let's say, a flavor of personality psychologists who believes intrinsically in the realness of personality, and that any change that you see is not real change. It's some surface thing, right? Stylistic or temporary or a state, and that given the opportunity, you're always going to come back to that core disagreeable self that is you. I'm just making attributions because they always say this to me, so I think they're disagreeable. So the key question there is, does the change last? If you see a psychotherapist, change while in psychotherapy is interesting but not definitive. What about afterwards? Well, it just so happens that a number of the studies tracked change well beyond the termination of therapy. So this is the average change on neuroticism while they're in therapy. 6 months later, it's still there. 6 months to a year, it's still there. 1 or more years, it's still there, with no fade out. Contrast this with the cognitive ability interventions that we do in the United States especially, and also in Europe, where you see distinct fade out when it comes to intervention. So at least from the psychotherapy literature, there isn't as much fade out, according to this meta-analysis. What kind of therapy worked best? They all worked. So it's otherwise known as the dodo bird effect. Clinicians don't like this. They still chafe and they'll argue with me. But for the most part, if you take a big step back, seeing a psychotherapist works. Doesn't really matter what they do. Work at it. And as a client maybe of a psychotherapist, you should treat them like products. If they're not working for you, find somebody else. Somebody will work for you. And it seems to do a good thing. And there really didn't seem to be any definitive signal that any one thing is better than another. The type of person you were, a patient, did matter. In particular, people who abuse substances were really hard to work with. Okay? What's really fun is that the personality disorder folks, despite having personality disorders, changed as much as everybody else. So I love that. Okay? So this is the sum total of the meta-analysis. We went back in and did a little estimate of how fast the change occurred within the therapeutic environment. And what you see is that most of the change was happening in the first 6 to 8 weeks of the therapeutic intervention, which from my perspective is profoundly fast. Yeah, I know, it's so fast. It's like, no way. But that's what the data say, right? But as some might attest to who know me well, I'm not a very trusting individual, and I was skeptical of my own meta-analysis. And so the opportunity arose to actually do some work with an individual who was going to do an intervention with drug and alcohol abuse patients. And I convinced said individual to design a study in a slightly different way and measure personality. And that was to assess these questions. Does it really happen so quickly? I kind of didn't believe my own data. Did it really last? Right? These are relatively special studies. Like, I just sensed a lot of motivated writing on the part of the clinicians who were writing these papers, because it was usually selling their type of therapy for being effective for some kind of outcome. So I had to believe there was some type of selection bias in terms of what was reported. Can the changes be attributed to those states, or is it really trait change? Most of the studies hadn't tracked both simultaneously, and so it would be really important to do that. So, needed research that tracked change more often and longer, and we needed one that tracked states simultaneously. To do this, I teamed up with Jordan Davis, who's now a professor at the University of Southern California. He was in social work. He came to me well before mindfulness was disparaged as trendy, and said, there seems to be good evidence that doing mindfulness-based training with substance use patients is more effective than treatment as usual. But I'd like to do this with a different population, and I would like your advice. I said, fine, I want you to do the following things. Well, sorry. I want you to assess personality, I want you to assess it more often, and I want you to follow them for 6 months, and I want you to assess states and traits. And he said, sure. Cooperative individual. I don't recommend this to you if you're a graduate student. I've never seen a graduate student work this hard. He pulled off his own RCT as a grad student for his dissertation, worked very, very hard for two years. So it's not easy. Most tenured professors choose not to do this. What did he do? He did an RCT where he recruited people going into our local drug and alcohol treatment center, randomly assigned them to MBRP, Mindfulness-Based Relapse Prevention Therapy. They were inpatients for the first 4 weeks or so. They got treatments, either MBRP or treatment as usual. Treatment as usual was CBT. In this case, to make the dose equivalent, the people in Tau were given extra AA meetings, which is a very typical thing. So they were interviewed or intervened on the same amount of time, so to speak. And then he assessed them every 2 weeks, which was a phenomenal effort, because many of these people, especially after they left the therapeutic situation, were so itinerant that they didn't even have cell phones. They would lose their cell phone week to week. He would make arrangements to meet them at a place. In 2 weeks, at this cafe in this town, I will meet you, and they would meet him. So that's the type of effort he put out to track these people down. MBRP, for those of you who don't know about it, is mindfulness-based relapse prevention therapy. It targets the negative thoughts, it targets craving. It teaches you, like a good mindfulness intervention, to have distance from your physiology and your psychology, so you try to, let's say, tolerate what's going on. You try to be aware instead of being on autopilot, which is one of the key problems for substance use. You try to identify in the process, what are the things that trigger you? Is it stress? Is it a person? Is it a place, right? And try to be cognizant of that. And then you get taught alternatives to those triggers. So you're actually given a skill set, which I think is important in this case, that you take with you outside of the therapeutic situation. And the effort was, of course, to decrease impulsivity. This is the assessment design. The first 4 weeks or so were in treatment, and then he followed everybody post-treatment. And measured lots of things. We have some controls, substance use. He assessed perceived stress, which will come in important here. And also on the personality traits, I asked him to use Saussier's 36QB6, which measured the big 6 instead of the big 5, because I thought it would be interesting. And he did that 15 times. What did he find? Here's substance use, so the interesting story for him as a dissertation was that mindfulness-based relapse prevention therapy worked really well. So these are substance use patterns. After they get out of therapy, there's still a little difference. The people going through treatment as usual were doing a little bit more. And then as you go through time, the people who were getting treatment as usual were going back to their life of doing drugs and alcohol. And the people who were in the mindfulness-based relapse prevention system did less. It's not that they were innocent of doing drugs, but they did far less than their compatriots. In terms of stress, everybody dropped in stress during the first 3 weeks or so, but then you saw an increasing difference between the two. It looks like the treatment as usual people are kind of getting stressed again. The groups were incredibly stressed in terms of their levels to start. Even at this stage, these are really high perceived stress scale scores. What do we find for personality? Here's the emotional stability findings. In therapy, there's no difference at the end of therapy. Both groups change, just like we found in the meta-analysis, right? Then at about 14 weeks, you have a D of 0.4 and a D of 0.86 at the termination of the study. So you see kind of the overall pattern that we found in the meta-analysis, very fast change, then a plateau, and in this case, the interesting thing being a slight distinction between the two types of treatments. And so, so let's think about that. Okay, so are the differences that you see here attributable to states or traits? Well, the correlation between changes in neuroticism and changes in stress were 0.64 during the treatment, 0.73 after the treatment. There's not much left over other than the change in states. You could take that as an indication that the change isn't true change, but then the weird thing you have to account for is that the change lasted for 6 months. I honestly don't know how to reconcile that yet. If you have some suggestions, I'm open to them. What was more interesting is that the effect of MBRP on personality traits was incremental to the changes in stress. So they were learning something in MBRP that helped them, and it helped them change their personality as much as it did help them not have cravings, not do drugs, and not be stressed, which is interesting. Okay. Conclusions from these studies. Short-term change patterns look really similar to the meta-analysis. Everything worked, everything got better with those first few weeks. They're indistinguishable from short-term changes in stress, and I think that's a reality in some respects, right? If you're going to get more emotionally stable, you're probably going to get less stressed because of the strong relationship between the two. So I'm still not, let's say, quite at a position of understanding what to do with that. In my mind, the treatment as usual group, as opposed to what we found in the meta-analysis, really looked like it was suffering from a fade-out. And so assiduously assessing personality and other items in that way really showed that pattern where everybody gets better, there's a little bit of time, and then suddenly you start seeing them coming back to where they were. And that's interesting in my mind because this is a slightly better design study than most of the studies we reviewed. It might be that there's a lot more fade-out, we just haven't been sensitive to them in the past. And then, of course, the MBRP worked to change personality and other things, too. Summary of the data. So I've got two studies I showed you in addition to the meta-analytic work. There's long-term stability and change about where you'd expect it to be based on our models. Not as high as cognitive ability, but high enough to say there's something going on. Okay? Mean level change does appear to be cumulative across the life course, which is interesting. And personality traits do change quickly. I showed you a meta-analysis, which I didn't believe, and then I showed you my primary data, which I might believe more. I still don't know, I'm still not going to be satisfied with it yet until we do more study. So I'll say there's tentative evidence that we can change personality traits. The fact that they do change quickly, as measured by personality psychologists, in my mind is indisputable. You have to accept that. You can interpret it however you want. You can say it's pseudo-change, not real change, whatever. But when we administer personality trait inventories to people seeking treatment, they change a lot in a short period of time. And so if you think those measures are special, somehow getting you something distinct, then you have to accept the fact that personality traits can be changed in a short period of time. Okay? Implications. Globally speaking, in the world of personality psychology, I like to stereotype a lot. So there's two camps. One is that personality traits are important and they predict outcomes. So this is the exogenous model of personality traits. They're temperaments, they're not only relatively enduring, they're very enduring. So they'll take our meta-analytic work and say, look, Robert said personality traits are really stable. I don't need to assess them again. They're exogenous to the system, they predict outcomes, right? Then, of course, you get other people who say, whenever I give a talk about personality, the second most common question I got about personality development was, well, if it changes, is it personality? Which I always found disappointing, because even cognitive ability develops. I mean, geez, why should personality be somehow different? But there's a very common assumption that if you show that things change, then the whole idea gets thrown out. And then they go, well, personality traits are ephemeral, they don't matter, they don't predict much. So if you kind of partition my field into two camps, this is a pretty good representation. So you've got the Michellians down here, you've got the big fivers up there. And I like to argue that the middle way, ironically said before I got into MBRP, is the right way. That this is the proper model of human development. They are biological. Everything's biological. That's nonsensical to say they're not. There is a signal in there, most likely and most appropriately attributed to genetics, because it's very hard for me to capture in any way, shape, or form what the environment is that's exactly the same when you're 16 and when you're 68. It's very easy for me to say your genetics are the same. And there does seem to be a signal, albeit a small one. Right? So that's there. And they're consequential because they do affect outcomes, but they're also changeable. They show systematic changes and they can be changed. And I think that's the right model. It's not a popular model. It makes you hold two seemingly opposing ideas in your mind at one time, as opposed to simple ones. Traits cause things or traits don't matter. Right? But I think this is the right model of human nature in general, whether or not exciting. Personality traits aren't as stable as cognitive ability. I think it's okay to think of them as exogenous, but I see papers in economics that say personality traits are stable, therefore I don't have to bother reassessing them. I think that's a mistake. It's also a missed opportunity, right? Because the development of personality might be important. It's also important, I think, given their level of stability, to start looking at the intervening mechanisms. What is it about your marriage? What is it about your work? What is it about your education that your personality created that created your life? And so looking at the intervening mechanisms becomes incredibly important. Okay, so that. Implications of change in personality. What does it mean? You might still be like me and be a bit skeptical of the therapeutic findings. So one invitation is to say, well, yeah, you showed that there are changes, but that change is ephemeral. It's not important. And I will readily admit that we haven't done a good job of establishing whether the change in personality is something we should pay attention to. Does it predict the outcomes we care about, above and beyond where you were to start with, right? So if it's something substantive, it's something critical to your life, making you more gritty, making you more conscientious, making you less impulsive, should have consequences for your life. And we don't know whether that's the case. So it's still possible to hold on to the idea that the changes that we've detected in therapeutic settings are ephemeral in the sense that they're not going to last, they're mostly attributable to states, and they won't have much consequence. I still think that's possible. If you accept that they do exist, and that they do exist for at least some people in the population, you do have to reconcile that with the patterns that we see in the observational data. And that's where I'm having a harder time. So one conclusion is that we've totally missed this, and I think it's true. Because the typical longitudinal study is done unsystematically, serendipitously. The Lothian birth cohort is a great example. We found the data, let's reassess them again, right? That's the prototypical longitudinal study. Project Talent study, we found the data in a closet, let's follow them up again. And it's not a very good way to go about your science, right? Because you really want to be tracking people continuously. But what we have as a data set are very long-term estimates of progressive change. And we absolutely don't have any data on the process. So we haven't assessed people continuously to see whether this happens. So it might be that the change we see is the result of a small set of people changing dramatically in a 6-month period, and for the rest of their life being incredibly stable. I just don't know, right? And I'd never imagined that as a possibility, which changes, again, your perspective on how human nature works and how human development works. So from this, I would say that the next generation of researchers should go about doing things better and differently than what we did. Marry the work that clinicians do, where they assess things continuously, with longitudinal studies where you follow people for years. Given fancy phones and watches and tracking devices, I suspect your generation will have the tools available that they could do that. I think that's what we need to do. And finally, for policy, I really do think personality traits are appropriately used in policy circles. They do predict functioning in love, work, and happiness, right? So one of the most important predictors of psychopathology is personality. It's a good predictor of income, educational attainment, job satisfaction. It's a good predictor of your marital discord or lack thereof, and whether you maintain a relationship. So it's important across different avenues or different contexts that really do have policy level implications and should be used as such. The comeback I got from the economists is that, but we really want to develop them, and what you see is that they are changeable and they can be changed. So they might be viable targets. I don't know if they should be, right? But the question of, well, can I teach children delay of gratification and will it stick is a personality question. And it might be a valuable personality question that can be asked because now we have evidence that not only do these traits change, but they can be changed. And that's all I've got. Thanks. No, it's a wonderful question, and it's a bigger question than a single question, so I might not answer it in a simple way. So the question is demographics and background. So you can parse that in a number of ways. So coming from a demography perspective, I'd say, okay, family background. If you're born poor, born rich, does that affect your personality? We have a meta-analysis. It was a smaller one that just came out. No, I don't think it's out. I think it was just posted as a preprint. The average correlation between your family SES and your personality is a correlation of 0.03. Which is really small. Does it matter whether you go to college or not? Not to my understanding. And I've looked at it at about 3 longitudinal studies. What you do in college counts a lot. Whether you go to college doesn't affect your personality. So I call this the independent effects model, that most of the variance is in the main effects. You know, please be born to an affluent family in the United States, right? You know, just don't do any of the alternatives if you have control over that. Much better for you for a whole host of outcomes. It's really good if you're blessed with some smarts, right? Independent of socioeconomic status. And it's probably good for you for a number of outcomes if you have some personality attributes that are positive, like being conscientious. Yeah? And so that's the main effects model. We've tried to do other models where we've conditioned, for example, the predictive validity of personality on outcomes. So there's this wonderful idea, the resource substitution idea, taken from sociology, stolen quite nicely, where it's, if you're coming from an impoverished background, however you define impoverished, your personality, your attributes are actually more important, right? And we found that to be true. If you're poor, in the project talent sample, it's more important to be conscientious. And you can view that from a number of different perspectives. That could be discrimination in action in a weird way, right? Oh, here's a poor kid. Oh, but he seems to be a hard worker. I think I'll invest in him, right? So that could be one thing. Or you could say that it's their pluck or their grit that's overcoming their background. It's a very interesting finding. Minuscule effect. You only find the effect with 10 to 15,000 people. So it's not a robust thing. Gender obviously plays out. I hope the men don't find this offensive, but women are more mature than men at an early age, and they stay that way. And from what I can tell, the men don't catch up. Sorry, guys. Ladies, you're welcome to take credit. I remember finding that and saying it, and Timmy Moffat was a co-author, and she's like, "That's your paper." And I said, "Yeah, more than my paper, come on." I have 2 daughters, so it's good to be positive about that. So those, the basic big demographics like that, though those effects are there, they usually don't moderate the things that we see. There isn't a gender moderation on the developmental patterns for the most part. Men and women, for the most part, develop the same way. Idiosyncratic experiences, yeah, they'll partition things differently. And some of those will be driven by gender and SES. But there's not a big story there. So
you said something very fascinating, at least to me, about the overall effect of college on personality, effectively zero.
yeah.
But you're saying it doesn't matter what you study. Could you expand this on that?
Well, if you do things in college, right, that are a result of college, you're more satisfied with your college experience. At the end, you'll be less neurotic than other people, right? If you do particular majors, you do particular things, as we've measured in some of the studies we've done. This is one dissertation that never got published. Not that I'm bitter about it. Always publish your dissertation, PhD students. The particular experiences, the achievements, the outlets, whether they're social outlets, social activities, extroversion, agreeableness, right? So but that's not at all unique to college, right? You say the same thing about work, you say the same thing about marriage. The particular experiences in these contexts do play out, at least in being associated with change. But what we haven't found a unique signal to college or the college experience to personality trait development in particular. So it's interesting. Way in the back. Uh-huh. Yeah, is it, well, I like to say at this point that neuroticism is clinical psychology. And interestingly enough, many of the clinical psychologists are coming around to the idea that basically what they do is change neuroticism. So David Barlow is the most famous example of this recently, saying that we should give up this distinction between all these different flavors of neuroticism that you have, because really at the core of almost all psychopathology is feeling anxious and feeling threatened, whether it's OCD, PTSD, phobias, right? At the core is neuroticism. You have different flavors that are manifest because of different experiences, but really the job of the therapist is to change the neuroticism, not these little particular things. I find that mollifying because Barlow is a behaviorist by training who spent many years basically saying you need to focus on the symptoms, focus on the manifestations. Now he's coming around saying, look, they're the same thing. I'm sympathetic to that. Sure. Yeah. Oh, yeah, of course. not only, and I didn't mention this, but sometimes I do, I mean, sometimes it's controversial to say you want to change somebody's personality. But on the other hand, isn't that what we want to do, right? I mean, when you send your supervisor off to leadership training school, are you expecting them to come back and immediately forget all the lessons, right? Your supervisor wasn't very good at delegating or inspiring you. They went to leadership training school, they got better at delegating and inspiring you. If they forget in a week, is that good? No, right? So lots of things that we do, education being one of them, we do with the idea that you're going to impart lessons and that those lessons are going to be learned and kept and possessed in perpetuity. That's personality change, right? So most of the situations where we're trying to do things, we're trying to do that. So I think it's relatively productive to think about approaching interventions transdiagnostically, right? That, okay, I want to make people better. And think about it from this perspective. If it's true, what I showed you, that personality affects all of those different life domains, if I get a little bit of increment on something like conscientiousness or neuroticism when somebody's young, I'm going to make their work better, their marriage better, and their happiness better, and their therapy better, right? Even if it's a small effect, it's still going to play out in a really profound way. So I know it gives some people the heebie-jeebies to think about changing personality traits, but it's kind of what we always want. And I think thinking about it in that transdiagnostic way is a good thing. There was another question in front. Yeah. Yeah. Right, right. Uh-huh. Yeah, yeah. Well, that's where the study that came out of your group was really good, right? Because the kids were assessed by teachers, and then in adulthood they were self-reported, the same measure, and then rated by friends and peers. So you had methodological consistency, right? In the Hampson and Goldberg paper, you're right, they started with teachers and they had self-reports, they didn't have good observer reports. In our study, it's nice because it's actually 2 self-reports, so it's the same method. You might argue that's a bad thing, I don't know. But I really like the paper that came out of this group because it really did a good job of trying to figure out. I think I have my opinions. I was a reviewer on the paper, if I may. I think I signed that review, did I not? I thought I did. About why they didn't get the consistency. And I think in their particular case, what teachers were rating back in that time wasn't personality. So, and what they were rating as adults was. So, but that's going to happen sometimes. Methodologically, that was the best study that's been done. So, yeah.
Did you observe any change in variance? So did people decline in neuroticism equally, or were they becoming similar?
In the intervention studies or the longitudinal study?
In general.
Okay. When it wasn't reported enough in the intervention studies to test. In the longitudinal studies that I have bothered to look at, no. I've seen no change in variance.
So the decline is pretty similar in
Yeah, yeah. So, but I know it happens in childhood, according to Renee, but we haven't seen it in adulthood. And you would think it would. I think part of the problem too is not getting into old age. I think if you get into old age, you'll see an increase in variability, but that's because of senescence, which is not good.
Is there a kind of initial value problem where the people who seek out therapy are super high in neuroticism in the first place, and then they've got more space to go?
Yeah.
And if you just took a random sample of the population and made them do the same thing, their personality wouldn't change as much?
Yeah. That is a distinct possibility. And I've tried desperately to find comparative samples, right? And look at the same question, and I haven't yet been able to get them. Part of the problem is the clinicians are not motivated to collect the data. And they're seldom motivated to do interventions on non-clinical patients. Now, it is the case, and this is in the meta-analysis, there's a weird group of studies that the pharmacological companies did where they thought, boy, it'd be great to give SSRIs, to the husband too, or to the wife. So they actually did these studies where they said, you're going to get the SSRI and your partner is also. And they tracked the change in those. The changes are kind of weird. There are changes, They're not quite the same. Like, so in a normal sample, it had, you know, nonsensical findings in some respects, but it had an effect on their personality. So those are the closest you could come to that. Yeah. Please. Oh, sorry.
The meta-analysis of the intervention, what kind of deep group representation do you have across the sample? And do you look forward to seeing like differences in how the effect play out across each group?
Yeah, we did. The question was, does age moderate the effect of clinical interventions on personality traits? And the answer is no. Now, you know, it was a sample of adults, primarily not young to middle age. I think the average age was about 32, but ranged. Not as many older individuals as you might expect, and not as assiduously assessed as you would want. But at least in the data that we had there, we found no age moderation, which is also a surprise. Yeah. So if you believe you can't teach an old dog new tricks, you might be wrong. Apparently from that data, that doesn't make any difference. There's a question over here. Yeah.
I kind of spoke about it a little bit, but I was wondering why there was the discrepancy between the loading bird cohort and the project sample in terms of like the stability of the personality trait.
So why is the Lothian birth cohort an outlier? And why do we get something different? I'll give you the least satisfying answer first, which is the most likely, which is sampling error, right? I mean, the modal effect size is 0.2. Just by chance, you're going to get a low effect. Yeah, that I would go with first. Totally unexciting. I'm a psychologist. I can't leave you with that. So the answer might be something different. As I alluded to, if you look at the correlates of the teacher ratings in childhood, it really looked like they weren't assessing dependability, which was the main theme in that data. They were assessing kind of good student, smart student, which is distressing to some degree because I always think of teachers as potentially the best possible source of information, right? Because they have a sample of this many students every year that they come in. They should be experts at distinguishing people. And at least in the correlates of that construct at that age, it didn't look like they were getting at what you might think of as dependability. So that's the other reason why I think there was a difference. Still the best designed study. The estimate stands for what it is.
Yeah, being a non-psychologist. Have your studies, or are there any studies getting this a great problem having in all countries the aging population and loneliness? Loneliness for a lot of people is right, will increase depression and heart problems.
Yes, yes.
And B, if any of your, say, the older generation went up to have any clinical interventions, loss of sight, coronary attacks, or incidents that could actually change their attitude or personality.
So we've looked at some of that, not directly. We haven't looked at loneliness. Of course, Cassiopo's work is definitive in that case. The data, I would put in Google health and retirement study and loneliness, because they started assessing loneliness in that study very early on, and there should be some reports about its clinical significance. And that's an aging study in the US, representative sample. It's quite good. I have not bothered to go in that direction, so I can't report any of our data. In terms of the old age and morbidity and those issues, we do know that your physical health is linked to your psychological health, and that if you decrease in physical health, you also decrease in traits like conscientiousness and increase in neuroticism. Dan Mracek, who was a researcher at Northwestern, it's a fascinating study. It was of the veterans of the Second World War, I believe, where he showed that increases in neuroticism predicted mortality above and beyond where you stood at the beginning of the study. You could take that one of two ways. Could be causing you to die, or you just can use personality and personality change as a diagnostic signal. Most likely they were probably suffering from some of the slings and arrows of old age, right? And feeling more neurotic and out of sorts because of that. And so you could use it as a diagnostic tool in some respects.
Personality change. Anybody's got their hand here, introverted way, try extroverted, throwing it up high.
Or we could go be extroverted and have some wine and cheese, but.
Any last question?
Renee?
Yeah, you said that the change was in states in the last study.
Yeah.
but then it was stable, right? So
Yeah.
it's kind of paradoxical. I was
Yeah.
wondering conceptually, how does this play with the Fleeson's idea of traits being basically these distributions of states? So you have kind of shifted the distribution of states.
Yeah. I think Fleeson's model is a great start, but it doesn't make the conceptual leap to what a trait is in an effective way. And I mean that by a trait is defined in some respects by its cross-situational, cross-time signal, not just by whether it's correlated with a state at any given time. So in my mind, I would agree entirely with Will that there are states and that the distribution at any given time is probably a great estimate of your trait, but it's not defining. That for me, I want to see that type of thing assessed continuously over time, states only. And then out of that, draw a signal for what's consistent, what's growing, and what's episodic. And what's consistent, and maybe what's growing, is the trait, not just the fact that there's a density distribution. It really comes down to across time, and 2 weeks in an ESM study is not long enough. You need to do something across years. That's where you can make the bridge between his model and the things you see here. And that's what might be going on in terms of the state level change, right? Yes, you're not stressed anymore because therapy was effective, and you're not as neurotic. Yeah, the causal conundrum is there, it's going to stay there, but if you are semi-permanently less stressed and more emotionally stable, that's what you want. That's a personality trait change. And of course it's going to be playing out in the state space at any given moment, but any given moment is not going to be diagnostic or telling for that pattern. Does that answer?
It's a question that 99% of the audience will have to ask Brent in person around drinks to explain the answer to.
After the drinks, I will not be able to answer the question. So,
So we thank Brent one more time, and psychopharmacology.
psychophonic. Okay.